The storm rolled over the valley like an old memory refusing to fade. Rain came hard and fast, drumming against the wooden fences and soaking the dirt road that led to the Ward Ranch. Clara pushed through the wind, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The small lantern in her hand flickered weakly, its glow fighting against the darkness. She had gone out to shut the gate before the storm hit, but what she found stopped her in her tracks. There, slumped by the gate, lay a man. He was unconscious, his uniform torn and covered in mud, one arm bleeding from a deep gash. For a long moment, Clara just stared. Fear rooted her in place, but something stronger, perhaps mercy, perhaps instinct, made her drop to her knees beside him. She tried to wake him, calling out through the rain, but he didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold. When lightning flashed across the sky, the brief light revealed a metal tag around his neck, a soldier's identification, and the name engraved on it made her blood run cold. Daniel Ward. She didn't know the man, but the name stirred something deep within her, something she thought she had buried long ago. Clara dragged him up with all the strength she had, calling for help as she stumbled toward the house. Her father looked up sharply when she burst through the door, soaked to the bone, struggling to hold the stranger upright. The old man's eyes filled with alarm and disapproval as he recognized the soldier's uniform. He had never trusted men who came from the war, not after losing his only son to it. But when Clara pleaded that the man would die if left outside, his resistance weakened. With a tired sigh, he helped her lay the stranger by the fire. For hours, Clara worked silently, washing the dirt and blood from the man's wounds. Her hands trembled, but she refused to stop. The soldier's breathing steadied little by little, and in the soft firelight, she finally saw his face clearly. Bruised, weary, but undeniably human. When she cleaned the metal tag around his neck again, her heart clenched. The name, Daniel Ward, gleamed faintly in the firelight. Her brother's name had been Eli Ward, and though this man was a stranger, something about him, the way his brow furrowed even in sleep, the scars, the quiet stillness, felt like a thread pulling her backward into memories she had long tried to forget. It was well past midnight when the man stirred at last. His eyes opened slowly, hazel eyes clouded with confusion. He tried to sit, but the pain forced him back down. He looked around as though unsure of where he was, until his gaze met Clara's. She told him softly that he was safe, that he had been found near the gate and brought in from the storm. When she mentioned the Ward Ranch, his expression changed. Something flickered in those eyes, something unreadable. He didn't speak again. He only turned his face toward the fire, watching the flames with a haunted kind of silence. And as Clara stood there, listening to the storm fading outside, she couldn't shake the strange certainty that this night, this man, had come into her life for a reason. The storm hadn't brought him there by accident. Morning came slow and pale over the valley, painting the ranch in silver mist. The storm had passed, but its scent still lingered, wet earth, cedar, and ashes from the night fire. Clara woke early, as she always did, and stepped quietly into the main room. The stranger was still asleep on the cot by the fire, his breathing even now, his face turned toward the faint light filtering through the window. For a moment, she simply watched him. The cuts on his face had begun to close, and his hands, rough and scarred, twitched slightly as if dreaming. Whoever he was, he had seen more than most men should. Her father entered soon after, his boots heavy on the old wooden floor. His expression stayed stern, but his tone softened slightly when he spoke. He asked whether the soldier was still alive. Clara nodded. The old man didn't reply at first. He simply looked at the stranger for a long time, the firelight flickering in his tired eyes. Then, quietly, he said that men like that only brought trouble, that the last time they'd opened their door to someone wearing a soldier's tag, it had cost them everything. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. The memory of her brother, the folded flag, the empty chair at the table, still lived too close to the surface. By noon, the stranger stirred again. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse. He asked where he was. Clara told him he was safe at the Ward Ranch, and that he had been found by the gate during the storm. He blinked slowly, trying to remember, and then nodded faintly. When she asked for his name, he hesitated, then whispered, "Daniel. Just Daniel." It was a name she already knew, yet hearing it from his lips sent a chill down her spine. Later that day, Daniel asked to see the barn. He said he needed to stand, to move, to prove he wasn't still broken. Against her father's protest, Clara helped him out into the sunlight. The ranch was quiet. Only the sound of distant horses and the low creak of the windmill filled the air. When they reached the barn, Daniel paused at the door. His eyes swept across the empty stalls, the dust, the faint smell of hay. He said softly that he used to work a place like this once, before everything went wrong. Clara didn't press him for details. Something in his voice told her that whatever he remembered wasn't peace, but pain. Instead, she told him about the horses, the ones they lost during the war, the ones still left. Her voice steadied as she spoke, though her hands trembled when she reached to stroke one of the mares. Daniel watched her quietly. There was a gentleness in his gaze, one that didn't match the roughness of his scars. He said she had a way with animals, the kind that came from kindness, not training. She smiled faintly at that, unsure how to answer. When the sun began to set, Daniel turned to her and asked why she had saved him. The question came out raw, as though he himself didn't believe he deserved saving. Clara said she didn't know. Maybe it was the storm, maybe it was the name, or maybe she just couldn't stand the thought of leaving someone behind the way her brother had been left. Daniel's eyes darkened at that, and for a moment, the barn fell silent. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, that some debts can never be repaid, but some lives are given back for a reason. That night, as Clara lay awake listening to the crickets, her thoughts wouldn't rest. There was something about the stranger she couldn't shake. The sadness in his eyes, the way he looked at the world like a man standing at the edge of redemption. She didn't know yet that the name Daniel Ward carried a truth far heavier than she could imagine, or that saving him would change the course of both their lives forever. The days that followed were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels fragile, as though one wrong word could break it apart. Daniel recovered slowly. The bruises faded, the limp lessened. He spent his mornings helping with repairs around the ranch, his movements steady but cautious, as if unsure how long he'd be allowed to stay. Clara often watched him from the porch. There was something strange about the way he worked, precise, disciplined, as though every nail, every stroke of paint was a way to atone for something unseen. The workers had begun to whisper. They said he carried himself like an officer, that his eyes were too sharp for a man with no past. Her father heard the talk too but said nothing, though his distrust hung thick in the air. One evening, Clara found Daniel in the barn again, mending a broken gate by lantern light. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands streaked with dirt and oil. Sweat glistened on his neck, and the soft glow of the lantern threw shadows across the scars that lined his forearm. Old, jagged, deliberate. "Does the work ever help you forget?" she asked softly, stepping closer. Daniel didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment, only the creak of wood and the clang of metal filled the silence. Then he looked up, and the quiet storm behind his eyes met hers. "Forget," he said finally. "That's not the goal. Remembering without drowning is." The words stayed with her long after she left the barn. Later that night, as the wind swept across the open fields, Daniel stood alone by the fence, staring into the dark horizon. The moonlight caught the edge of something around his neck, a rusted dog tag, worn smooth by time. He pulled it off and turned it in his palm. The name etched into the metal had begun to fade, but it was still there. Captain Daniel Ward. A name she didn't yet know. A truth he couldn't yet tell. At dawn, Clara found him asleep by the barn wall, his coat draped over his shoulders, the dog tag glinting faintly in the rising light. Something about him looked both lost and found at the same time. She knelt beside him quietly, brushing a strand of hair from his face before she could stop herself. The touch woke him. His eyes opened slowly, soft at first, then sharp with recognition. Neither moved. For a heartbeat the world held still. And in that stillness, something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not yet, but the fragile beginning of it. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, quick and wild. The wind tore through the valley, and the smell of rain carried a weight of memory. Daniel froze as thunder cracked, not from fear, but from something deeper, a memory buried so far down it still burned when it rose. Clara saw it, the way his eyes went distant, the way his breath shortened. "Daniel?" she said quietly, taking a step toward him. He didn't answer, so she reached out, her hand brushing his arm. He didn't pull away. The rain came down in sheets, soaking them both. When he finally looked at her, his expression said what words couldn't. That she was the only light in a world he thought had gone dark forever. That night, as the storm raged and then passed, the ranch slept. But Daniel didn't. He stood by the window of the small room they'd given him, staring out at the fading lightning, the echo of old fire still alive in his mind. He remembered the battlefield, the screams, the smoke, the moment he thought he saw her face in the chaos before everything went black. And for the first time he wondered if fate had brought him back, not to survive, but to make things right. The morning after the storm broke clear and golden. The air was sharp, the world washed clean. But beneath that brightness, unease lingered, quiet, invisible, waiting. Clara noticed it first. Her father moved slower than usual, his eyes narrowing every time Daniel passed by. Conversation died when Daniel entered a room. Something had shifted. Later that day, one of the ranch hands brought her a crumpled scrap of paper, still damp from the rain. A torn letter. She smoothed it out, squinting to read the faded ink. Only one line was clear enough to make out. Ward presumed dead. Her father took the letter from her gently. He didn't say a word, but the silence that followed was heavier than any outburst. From that moment, the distance between him and Daniel grew, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. That afternoon, Daniel saddled a horse. "I just need some air," he said quietly when Clara appeared by the barn. Her father's eyes followed them, suspicious but silent. Clara trailed Daniel from a distance, the wind tugging at her hair. She told herself she was only making sure he didn't stray too far. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wanted to understand him. The quiet, the scars, the way he looked at the horizon like it was something he still needed to conquer. From a ridge, she watched him stop beside the old well. He knelt, brushed the dirt away from the rim, and stayed there for a long while. When he finally stood, something in his face had hardened, like he'd just uncovered a truth the earth had tried to keep buried. He didn't speak when he returned, but that night, curiosity pulled her back to the well. She dug through the damp soil until her fingers hit something cold, a rusted insignia, its engraving barely visible in the moonlight. One word still shone through the grime: Ward. Inside the house, the fire burned low. Her father sat before it, the torn letter open on his knee. The flames flickered across his face. Not anger, not yet, but something worse: recognition. He didn't notice her at first when she entered. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Do you know that name?" Clara hesitated. "Only what I've seen." He stared into the fire. "I knew him once. Captain Daniel Ward." The words seemed to cost him something. He led a rescue mission during the war, one that failed. Dozens gone. One of them, his voice broke for a moment. "One of them was my brother." Clara said nothing. She couldn't. Later, she stood on the porch, watching Daniel in the yard. The sunset had turned the sky to burning gold, and he looked smaller against it. A man weighted by ghosts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small dog tag, the metal catching the dying light. He turned it over in his hand once, then closed his fingers around it like a man holding his past too tightly to let go. Clara's heart twisted. She wanted to go to him to ask, "Is it true?" But her father's words echoed through her mind. Maybe some ghosts didn't come back for redemption. Maybe they came back to finish what they started. That night, thunder rolled again. Not from the sky, but from everything about to break. And when dawn touched the valley, nothing on the Ward Ranch would ever be the same again. The dawn came quiet, too quiet. Not peace, but waiting. The kind of silence that settles before something breaks. Inside, breakfast sat untouched on the table. Clara's father stood by the window, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the figure outside. Daniel, brushing down one of the horses as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The truth had clawed its way to light, and truth never comes without demanding payment. The door creaked open. Footsteps echoed across the porch. A shadow spilled over the sunlight. Her father stepped out first. Clara followed, heart hammering, her palms slick with dread. Daniel turned toward them before they spoke, sensing the storm in their silence. The wind caught his shirt, the morning light tracing the scar that cut across his temple. The same scar from every old war story, every whispered rumor. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then her father's voice broke the stillness. Low, rough, trembling with years of words finally set free. "Where have you been all this time?" he asked. Daniel didn't answer. "Why do you carry that name, Ward?" Still nothing. Her father took a step closer. "Tell me if it's true. Are you the man who left my brother behind?" Daniel's eyes lowered. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I didn't leave him." Her father's breath caught. "I tried to go back," Daniel said, the words falling like stones. "The orders were wrong. Everything fell apart. There was fire, smoke everywhere. I couldn't see anything. By the time I found the others, it was too late." He looked away, the pain raw in his face. "I've lived with that night every day since." For a moment, Clara thought her father might strike him. His hand twitched at his side, anger and grief warring behind his eyes. But instead, his voice broke, quiet and uneven. "You think guilt changes what happened?" Daniel didn't speak. Her father stared at him a long while, then said, almost to himself, "The dead don't rest easy when the living keep their silence." He turned and walked back toward the house. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the still air like a gunshot. Clara stood frozen. Daniel didn't move. Only the wind stirred, carrying her father's words away into the hills. When she finally found her voice, it came out soft. "Was it true? All of it?" He looked up then, his eyes shadowed and old. "Yes," he whispered, "but not the way he thinks." The hurt in her eyes wasn't anger. It was heartbreak, the kind that lives between understanding and fear. She turned before the tears could fall, and he let her go. That night, Daniel packed what little he had. A torn coat, a canteen, and the dog tag that still bore his name. The ranch had given him shelter, but never peace. He paused once by the barn, glancing toward the house. A single lantern still burned in Clara's window. He almost smiled. Almost. By the time the sun broke the horizon, he was gone. The sound of his boots faded into the wind, swallowed by the open fields. From her window, Clara watched him disappear, a lone figure against the gray dawn. Her chest ached, but she didn't call out. Some roads, she knew, had to be walked alone before they could ever lead home again. In the pale light, a single chair rocked gently on the porch. The door behind it stood half open, as though waiting for someone who wouldn't return. And for the first time in years, the old ranch felt something it hadn't known in a long while. Not hatred, not forgiveness, just truth. Raw, unflinching, and alive. And sometimes that's where every reckoning begins. The road stretched far beyond the valley, miles of dust and silence. Daniel rode without looking back, the rhythm of the horse beneath him steady and hollow. Every hoofbeat felt like a memory he was trying to outrun. The hills melted into the horizon. Towns flickered past, nameless, colorless, forgettable. But the weight stayed. The names of the men he couldn't save. The face of the woman he'd hurt without meaning to. At night, he built small fires that barely kept the dark away. The flames licked his scars in orange light, and sleep came only in fragments, because the past always knew how to find him. Days blurred into weeks. He worked where he could, fixing fences, mending gates, breaking wild horses. Anything that kept his hands moving and his thoughts quiet. But one evening, in the fading light of an old mining town, he heard a name that stopped him cold. Holt. A voice from the saloon. Loud, drunk, careless. Daniel froze in the dust outside the door. Holt. The man who'd sold the coordinates. The one who'd bought his survival with the blood of his men. Inside, a rough laugh cut through the piano noise. Daniel's grip tightened on the doorframe. Then he pushed it open. The room fell silent. Every head turned except one. At the back table, a man with a scar over his eye and a whiskey glass in his hand looked up slowly, a smirk spreading across his mouth. "Well, I'll be damned," Holt drawled. "Didn't think ghosts walked this far." Daniel stepped forward. His voice was low, calm, and dangerous. "I came for answers." Holt chuckled, setting his glass down with a click. "Answers are for men who survived." The next seconds shattered like glass. A chair scraped. A hand moved. A flash of steel. Gunfire cracked through the room, short, sharp, final. Smoke filled the air, burning and bitter. When it cleared, Holt was on the floor, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading beneath his hand. Daniel stood over him, chest heaving, the gun trembling. Holt spat into the dirt, laughing through the pain. "Still the hero, huh?" Daniel stared down at him, and in Holt's eyes he saw himself. The same ruin, the same guilt, the same exhaustion of men who'd lived when they shouldn't have. He lowered the gun and walked away. Outside, the rain had started. Slow, heavy drops that turned the street to mud. Thunder rolled far off, echoing like distant cannon fire. Daniel paused beneath the awning, his hand still shaking. He didn't know it yet, but someone was watching. A shadow across the road, silent, patient, eyes cold as stone. The past wasn't done with him. Not yet. Back at the ranch, the days dragged on. Clara said little, but every evening she found herself by the fence, eyes tracing the line where the sky met the hills. Her father thought she'd stopped hoping. He was wrong. Sometimes at dusk, she imagined she saw a rider far off, just a blur, gone before she could be sure. Some nights, she dreamed instead of that morning he left, of the silence that fell between them like a wound that wouldn't close. Even in sleep, her heart refused to let go. She didn't know it yet, but their paths were already turning back toward each other. Slow, inevitable, drawn by something that outlasted guilt, war, and distance. Not fate, not duty. Love, the kind that refuses to die quietly. Far out on the open road, lightning split the sky. Daniel pulled his coat tight and kept riding. The long road home had begun, and somewhere between guilt and redemption, a reckoning waited. Night fell heavy over the hills, thick as smoke. Daniel rode through it without stopping, unaware that danger had already picked up his trail. Behind him, a single rider followed, keeping low, keeping quiet. Mason read. He'd been at the saloon. He'd seen Holt bleeding on the floor. And now, he was coming for the man who left his friend to crawl away in the dirt. By dawn, the sky burned orange across the ridges. Daniel stopped by a river, letting his horse drink while he washed the dust from his face. The water mirrored him back. Older, wearier, hollow around the eyes. For the first time in days, his thoughts drifted to Clara. Her voice, her eyes, the way she'd looked at him that morning. Not with hatred, but with something far heavier. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing the small locket she'd given him years ago. He didn't know why he still carried it. Maybe because it was proof that once someone had believed he could still be good. The thought barely formed before a sound cut through the stillness. A twig snapping behind him. His horse lifted its head, nostrils flaring. Daniel froze. Then came the flash of steel, a knife spinning through the air. He ducked, the blade grazing his shoulder. He spun, gun already drawn. "Mason!" he muttered, voice low. From the trees, a man stepped out. Tall, gaunt, rifle in hand, eyes dead cold. "Should have finished Holt," Mason said, smirking. "Would have saved me the trouble." The river roared between them. Neither spoke again. There was nothing left to say. They moved fast, brutal, no mercy. Mud flying, fists slamming, gunfire cracking against the morning air. Daniel's shoulder burned. Mason swung wild, rage twisting every movement. A shot rang out, sharp, final. When the echo faded, Mason lay face down in the mud, his rifle half buried by the water. Daniel stood over him, chest heaving, smoke curling from his gun. He didn't pull the trigger again. He didn't have to. For a long moment, he just stared at the man who'd hunted him, and saw himself reflected there. Two soldiers still fighting wars that refused to end. He holstered the gun slowly, blood soaking through his sleeve. The sun was rising over the hills. It was time to stop running. Time to go back. Days later, Clara stood by the well, drawing water for the horses. The wind carried dust and memory in equal measure. Then she heard it. Hooves, slow and uneven, coming down the road. Her heart stumbled. When she looked up, the breath left her. Daniel, dust-streaked, wounded, eyes full of something like apology. For a long moment, neither moved, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they hadn't said, everything waiting to be forgiven. From the porch, her father stepped out, his jaw tightening. He didn't need to ask who the rider was. The memory was still fresh, still raw. Daniel dismounted slowly, removing his hat. "I'm not here to stay," he said quietly. "Just to make things right, before I go where I should have gone a long time ago." The old man said nothing. The space between them hung thick. Anger and sorrow twisted together. But Clara spoke instead. "Come inside," she said softly, "before the sun goes down." And just like that, for the first time in years, the door opened to him again. That night, Daniel sat by the fire, his arm freshly bandaged. The flicker of the flames danced between him and Clara, lighting the silence that had grown too deep to ignore. She watched him, not with anger, but with a question in her eyes. A question only he could answer. Because coming back wasn't enough. He'd have to prove he'd finally stopped running from the man he was meant to be. Morning light crept into the farmhouse like a cautious guest. It slipped across the floorboards, touched the old table, and found Daniel sitting quietly by the fire. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, strong, bitter, familiar, mixing with the faint crackle of the logs he'd stacked before dawn. He hadn't spoken much since he returned. Neither had Clara. But sometimes silence says what words can't. Her father, Henry Burke, sat at the table, the same chair he'd claimed every morning for 30 years. He stared at the man across from him, the man he once swore would never cross his threshold again. Yet here he was, bruised, bleeding, breathing. When Henry finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "Men like you don't change," he said. "No word can bring back what your choices took." Daniel didn't look away. He didn't argue. "I didn't come for forgiveness," he said quietly. "Just the truth." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a folded letter. Weathered, torn, edges marked with old blood. He placed it on the table between them. "It's from Holt," he said. "Written before the ambush." Henry hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting was shaky. The words rushed. A confession born of fear. Holt and a man named Mason Red had struck a deal. Steal the army's funds, pin the betrayal on Daniel, disappear before anyone could question it. The letter said everything. Proof that Daniel hadn't betrayed anyone. He'd been the one betrayed. Henry read it twice, slower the second time. By the end, his hands trembled. The room felt smaller, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. When he finally lifted his eyes, he saw not the reckless soldier who had once broken his daughter's heart, but a man who had carried his punishment long after everyone else had stopped remembering why. Clara stood in the doorway, the morning light catching in her hair. Her throat ached as she watched them. Her father silent, Daniel still, the letter lying between them like a wound laid open. All those years, she had believed he'd been guilty. She had watched him leave without ever fighting for his name. Now she understood why. Sometimes pain feels easier than proving you were right. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. I waited, she said, not in hope, in anger. And now that I know the truth, I don't even know what to feel anymore. Daniel looked up at her, eyes tired but steady. All I ever wanted, he said, was for you to know I didn't lie. I loved you too much to drag you through the mess I made. Her breath caught at that, not because of the words, but because she knew he meant them. Outside, the wind swept through the fields, clean, alive, carrying the scent of wet soil and grass after rain. Henry rose from the table slowly, the years showing in every motion. He looked at Daniel for a long time before speaking. A man can't outrun his past, he said, but maybe he can walk beside it and still make peace with what's left. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was closer than Daniel had ever stood to it. As the day faded, Daniel stepped outside. The ranch stretched out before him, gold under the dying sun. The same land that had once cast him out now holding him in quiet acceptance. Clara joined him, her presence soft beside his. They didn't touch, didn't need to. I still don't know how to forgive you, she said. I'm not asking you to, he replied. Just to let me try to be someone worth forgiving. The wind moved between them, gentle, restless, alive. And though neither spoke again, both felt it deep down. The past had burned, but from its ashes, something fragile and true had begun to rise. Days passed, and the world seemed to find its rhythm again, though not quite the same one it had before. Daniel stayed. First, Henry said nothing. He simply handed Daniel a shovel and pointed to the broken fence line behind the barn. That was his way of saying he could stay for now. Daniel worked without complaint. Blisters rose on his hands, matching the ache in his chest, but he welcomed both. For the first time in years, the pain had purpose. Clara watched him from the porch sometimes, a quiet storm behind her eyes. There were moments when she wanted to forgive him, to let herself feel what she used to. And then she remembered the years of silence, the graves he never visited, the truth he never fought to tell, and her heart hardened again. Still, something in him disarmed her. He moved differently now. There was no arrogance in his stride, no anger in his voice. Only a man trying to rebuild something he wasn't sure could be rebuilt. One afternoon, while gathering tools from the shed, Clara found Daniel sitting on a step, cleaning the rust from a horseshoe. He looked up, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Do you still ride the chestnut mare by the creek?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No," she said softly. "The horse went wild after you left. I couldn't bring myself to train it again." Daniel nodded, eyes lowered. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be tamed twice," he murmured. His words lingered. They weren't about the horse, and she knew it. Later that evening, they sat at the same table for the first time in years. Henry had gone to town, leaving behind the soft ticking of the clock and the smell of bread still warm from the oven. For a while, neither spoke. Then Daniel quietly said, "Holt and Mason read. They're both gone. The war took care of them long before I could." His voice held no satisfaction, only a sorrow that weighed heavier than words. Clara looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What will you do now? Now that your name is cleared?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I'm not even sure where home is anymore." When she looked up at him then, He wasn't the ghost she had been angry at. He was a man trying to find a way back to the living. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. The wind was restless again, whispering through the cracks of the old farmhouse. She stepped outside, and there he was, sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the stars. He didn't turn when she approached. "Sometimes," he said softly, "I still hear the gunfire when the wind blows a certain way. Some nights, I wonder if peace is just another kind of silence." Clara sat beside him, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "I understand," she said quietly. She didn't offer comfort or empty words. She simply spoke from experience because she too had spent years listening to ghosts. For the first time, they didn't feel like strangers sharing pain. They felt like two broken halves of the same story. When dawn came, Daniel looked at her, the morning light soft in his eyes. "Maybe starting over," he said, "isn't about forgetting the fire. It's about learning to live with the scars." Clara didn't answer. She just reached out, placing her hand over his. In that quiet touch, under the first morning light, something fragile and new began to breathe again. The days grew longer, and the air began to warm again. Spring had returned to the valley. Quiet, cautious, but alive. The Wardell Ranch stood like a survivor of time itself. The fences were mended. The fields breathed again. And for the first time in years, laughter drifted through the open windows. Daniel worked the land as if trying to earn every sunrise. He spoke little, smiled more. There was still guilt in his eyes sometimes, but also peace. Clara saw it too. She no longer watched him from a distance. She walked beside him now, helping where she could, arguing when she must, laughing more than either of them thought possible. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew what was growing between them again. Not the wild, reckless love of youth, but something steadier, something tested and true. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and turned the hills gold, Clara stood by the fence watching the colts run. Daniel joined her, his hands rough and scarred, but steady. "I've been thinking about leaving," he said quietly, his voice low. "Heading east, starting new." Clara's heart caught, though she didn't show it. She asked softly, "Is that what you really want?" He shook his head slightly. "I'm not sure. Maybe for the first time, I don't want to run anymore." They stood there for a while, the silence easy now, full, not empty. Then Daniel turned toward her, voice certain. "I've spent years trying to prove I wasn't the man everyone thought I was. But now, all I want is to be the man you can forgive." Clara met his gaze, and there was no anger left in her, only truth. "Forgiveness isn't something you have to ask for anymore," she said. "You've already earned it, every day you stayed." He reached for her hand, hesitating like he always did, but she closed the distance. That night, they sat together on the porch as the last light faded behind the hills. The wind carried the scent of rain and wildflowers, and the world felt softer somehow. "I used to believe love was something you could lose," Daniel said quietly. "Maybe love," Clara replied, "is something that waits, buried under everything broken, patient enough to outlive pain." He smiled at that, the first real smile she'd seen since before the war. And when he leaned closer, their kiss was simple. No promises, no vows, just peace. As the stars rose above the ranch, Clara rested her head against his shoulder. For once, there was no past between them, only the steady rhythm of two hearts still brave enough to try again. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the world would keep on breaking and mending itself over and over. But here, on this quiet porch, beneath this forgiving sky, two people who had lost everything had found something worth keeping. Not revenge, not redemption, just love, the kind that stays.